something's happening. There's a big vibe shift happening in politics this week. So in the last week, we've had Liz Truss talk to the Lotus Eaters and not back down from speaking to us. That's been wonderful. And then out of the ether came Nigel Farage. He's back. He's running in Clacton. He's taken over from Richard Tice as leader of Reform UK. And it seems there's going to be a big shift in terms of overall votes and possibly translating to a few seats. I think the most recent poll today said 4. But that's not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what kind of ground game is he running? Because it seems to me, and we're not going to play this because it is a copyrighted song, because Eminem's, is it Without Me? That's the real Slim Shady.
I really don't like Eminem, so
no, I'm not a big fan of Eminem. However, it is very fitting because he's done like little fan cams and things like that. He's got a very interesting mimetic ground game that all of the other politicians just don't have.
And he also has this impish grin, which I absolutely respect because, I'm also capable of it.
Well, yeah, you laugh at Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin. So
Yes, exactly.
It's brilliant. And I think Farage, as he said in his announcement, he's injected some much needed jubilance into an otherwise boring and sclerotic election. Did either of you watch that dreadful debate yesterday on ITV?
I didn't watch the debate, no. I knew what would happen.
I would have had a better time wrapping my testicles in barbed wire. It was like, which insincere bank manager do you trust to raise net migration over the next 5 years? Is it red or is it blue? And they both shouted at each other and looked impotent and miserable.
Well, the whole purpose of the debate to kind of establish how people are going to vote was sort of void when everyone knows it's going to be Keir Starmer that's going to be Prime Minister. It is a done deal, right?
That, and also the policies are indistinct, other than Labour might be slightly more expensive and Rishi Sunak might do gay race communism slightly slower.
Well, I reject the politics of everyone on the podium, so it's like hearing, people fighting about something I don't care about.
Yeah, quite. And that's that exact reason is why so many people were disaffected and not willing to vote at the next election. I think Farage coming into it has meant that a lot of people, particularly radicalised young men, radicalised for all the right reasons, if you're watching this, you're probably our audience, are now more likely to go out and make a stand.
What I really cannot understand about the debate last night, I watched part of it, is how on earth can you have the ambition to become a prime minister and want to put up a performance like that?
Well,
they had zero confidence in what they were saying.
Yes, because Keir Starmer's strategy is to stay away from the cameras and be as vague as possible because he thinks he's a write-in candidate because the Tories have collapsed their own base. And Rishi Sunak's strategy is to scramble to buy off the boomers as much as possible to keep some of the safe seats. So none of them are actually going for the floating voters because most of those aren't voting at all. That's what Farage is picking up. And he's right when he says there is a massive constituency that just hasn't been captured there yet. But briefly, before I go into that, something that did happen yesterday was that Farage had a milkshake thrown at him. So I'm going to play the clip. I will quickly mute it because the sound is... So you see here, he's walking out of the Wetherspoons, and then some woman in a white tracksuit comes up and throws a presumably banana milkshake from McDonald's all over him. Now, this woman is a single mother. She has an OnlyFans account, and she's a Corbynista. Unlike the conspiracy theories online that even an LBC host said, this is not Emily Hewitson, who is a friend of Farage's, working to generate controversy for the thing. If you say that, she's probably going to sue you. Can confirm that wasn't Emily. Won't like to kiss and tell. But anyway, point being, Farage has then made memes out of this. Again, capitalising on this just by going, yeah, not great that Joe Brown once said you should throw battery acid in my face, but I'm not going to be stopped by some tart dousing me in a McDonald's milkshake. And things like this. And I think that's a much better way of handling things than the insecurity or tightly controlled Blairite messaging of either Starmer or Sunak.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's wise.
Milkshake vibes intensifying.
Being able to take a bit of banter, is necessary. If you're a proper English person, right? Well, I suppose it's true of the Welsh and the Scots as well. A bit of back and forth, a bit of banter is normal. That's how normal people talk to each other. And the fact that politicians are so wooden and inhuman just further disaffects them. So, the disaffecting is useful in that it makes people realise that these people are not for their interest. But Farage seems to do being normal quite well.
Well, the fact that he's at risk of being milkshaked from close proximity is awful, but it also shows that he's literally in touch with his constituency, unlike the regional managers of the UK as a sort of satellite branch of a global hegemony that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have morphed into. And remember, Keir Starmer said he prefers Davos to Westminster. Well, Nigel Farage has spent exactly one day in Clacton, and he's already endeared himself to the locals to the extent where hundreds of them just come out to hear him speak as his campaign manager puts a stereo on top of his head. Like that's brilliant. I love that. It's great. So who was he specifically talking about in his announcement speech that said there's something happening, there's a big movement? Well, I decided to clip it because he kept talking about, and I'll play this for a second. He kept talking about how there is something happening. There are young people up and down the country, and the reason he ran was because they were themselves saying, "There's nobody to vote for, and I feel betrayed if you don't run."
No, I also know, just as throughout Europe, there is a new phenomenon racing through politics ahead of these European elections this weekend. I promise you, something is happening out there. I've been in this game 30 years. I fought lots of elections. I've generally got a pretty good sense of timing. Something is happening out there. So yes, I changed my mind, and you know what? I'm not ashamed of it one little bit.
So I think, just having encountered random people in train stations and at events, we know there are a lot of young men across the UK watching our stuff. They range from their mid-30s to even still in school. There is something palpable about the dispossession of people born since 1997 who have never known anything but Blairism, mass migration, the deprivation of job opportunities and housing, that mean they're not in tune with the liberal paradigm anymore, and they're more likely to direct their energy towards someone like Nigel Farage. And I think there are quite a few people that he's pointing out as a kind of constituency that doesn't show up in polls because they weren't going to vote for Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer. Now Farage has come along, he's galvanizing something tangible.
I think that this is absolutely the case. And I've taught for 6 years at university. And you could say that, essentially that's teaching children that just left school. And the men from them, they're absolutely pissed off with the indoctrination that they have, because in the past, you could say that the left had a stronger hold on them because the narrative was only economic oppressor versus economically oppressed. Now there's a direct targeting of men.
White men.
They're not having it. They're not having it, and they're absolutely pissed off with it.
Well, if in every classroom, I've been saying this for a little while. I mean, I said this on trigonometry and it resonated. So that's good. If white men have been actively demonized by all of their blue-haired feminist teachers for ages, and they hear constantly about how they're at fault for all of society's problems, and anytime they manifest competence, it's just another proof of toxic patriarchy, when millions of them don't even have a dad in the home, then yeah, they're going to get a bit resentful of that. And the first candidate that comes along and says, actually, you've been deprived of a cultural inheritance, job opportunities, the ability to have a family, your ability to own homes has been indefinitely deferred at the altar of mass migration and increasing the GDP while you're getting personally poorer and your high street is being robbed from you, then yeah, they're going to be pretty annoyed about that. And anyone who comes along and says, I'm going to fix that, they're going to gravitate towards them, which is encouraging.
Well, this affects us as well, right? We're sort of within this age bracket where we're getting screwed over by all of these problems as well. We're having to live through it, and as does anyone who doesn't really, have a stake in the economy. Anyone who's not in the housing market, for example, or doesn't have any feasible way of getting into it. That is this demographic, right?
Any man under 35.
Yeah.
The most common arrangement currently for anyone 18 to 35 in the UK is living at home with their parents. So that just means that if you want to have the native British population having families, you're not going to have that. So you're actively encouraging the worst kinds of benefit subsistence, a disproportionate number of whom are foreign nationals in the last few years, to come over and have lots of kids. And so you're making me pay for them while I'm trying to save for a deposit that's constantly being outpaced by inflation. Yeah, anyone who comes along and says, I'm going to fix that, yeah, of course loads of people are going to vote for them. That's also happening in Europe, which is very interesting. This is obviously this year, lots of elections are happening. I think it's France, Germany, the Dutch ones have just happened, which you did excellent coverage of.
Thank you.
The US elections are happening. We're seeing a massive swing towards parties like the AFD, or particularly towards Donald Trump among young men in America, because they are sick of migration being the principal issue and economic mismanagement robbing them of their lives and their livelihoods.
It turns out if you treat, young men poorly, they're not going to support you. It's funny that, isn't it?
Yeah, for all the whittering on about democracy, they don't actually like when the vote is
There's a reason
away.
I'm here, right?
Yeah, quite. So I'm just going to read a little bit. In Belgium, France, Portugal, Germany, and Finland, younger voters are backing anti-immigration and anti-establishment parties in numbers equal to and even exceeding older voters. Analyses of recent elections and research of young people's political preferences suggest. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' anti-immigration far-right Freedom Party, far-right, do one, right?
That's Politico.
Okay. Yeah, far right just means that he doesn't think that all people are ultimately fungible and we can import infinity immigrants from here to the heat death of the universe.
I think, if anything, they're classical liberals more. They're the sort of free market and liberalization.
Gert is opposed to Islam because he's pro-Israel, pro-gay, and pro-women's rights. He's not opposed to it in some sort of like identitarian ethno-nationalist way. So it's a very liberal opposition to Islam. So far right again.
Well, I mean,
ludicrous.
There are plenty of prominent liberals, at least in 1990s, early 2000s, that were very outspoken about Islam, weren't they? It's
Ayaan
not
Hirsi
unheard
Ali,
of.
remaining one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, there you go. In the Netherlands, Wilders' party won the 2023 election on a campaign that tied affordable housing to restrictions on immigration, a focus that struck a chord with young voters. Yeah, well, if you keep importing people and raise house prices, people that can't get a house are going to be annoyed. Shock. In Portugal, the party, I'm not going to say far right, Chega, which means enough in Portuguese, drew on young people's frustration with the housing crisis, among other quality of life concerns. The analysis also points to a split. Young women often reported support for Greens and other left-leaning parties. Amazing what birth control will do. Anti-immigration parties did particularly well against young men. So let's look to the UK, because so far, we haven't, before Farage was running, had an anti-immigration candidate. Because Rishi Sunak has promised, as soon as Farage ran, to lower migration. Do you know how he's going to do that? He's going to ask the Migration Advisory Committee, the quango that increased migration in the first place, in line with to increase GDP, mainly among students, to set an arbitrary cap. So the cap is probably going to be higher than the current level of net migration, but lower than it would have projected to rise by. That's absolutely what's
I have a quick question for Stelios. Have you noticed anything in Greek politics following these trends? Because I've seen a lot of trends in sort of northwestern Europe. Is it translating in, the Mediterranean world?
I think slowly.
Slowly.
It is beginning to take hold, but we had 10 years ago, we had this, but with more, you could say, further right, very hard right, and far right parties.
Is that the Golden Dawn?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Not a political sense of the term far right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But people are being pissed off, are being frustrated with the current government.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, do carry on.
No. Justifiably so. Well, now, do you remember this article from a couple of years ago now? It was November 2022. I wanted to draw on this because there's connective tissue between how Farage was perceived back then and by who, and him running now. So, I think this is a reasoned event that was hosted by Darren Grimes at the time. And he invited a bunch of people, including Steve Baker, who at the time was pro-Brexit and anti-lockdown, has since become a political cuckold who's about to lose his seat, and deservedly so. Daniel Hannan, who was a pro-Brexiteer, free marketeer, the kind that said global Britain, basically open borders, and Nigel Farage. And the reception Farage got was much more favourable than that for Baker and Hannan, who were essentially booed by the Zoomers that were in the audience for their migration stance and their woolly Thatcherism that's just been microwaved from the grave. So, like Hitchens, the young men in this room think Britain has been abolished and that the Conservative Party is not conservative at all. Ambient British pop culture, whether RuPaul's Drag Race or footballers taking the knee, bristles with personalities and causes that unsettle them. They see wokeness as a virus, infecting every aspect of British culture. That's why they love Nigel. In 2016, he proved to them that Conservatives, real Conservatives, could beat the left-wing establishment. To whoops, Farage promises a third coming, a return to frontline politics, which we're now seeing, if the state of the nation keeps deteriorating. One better than Jesus. Doubtful. Their love for him cannot be understated. Nige, big fan is the way that they frame their questions to him. Yet Farage, beyond his Brexit boosterism, is so unmistakably 80s. His agenda, where it rises above being a disgruntled mood, is not theirs. A global free trading power. At least half of the audience is protectionist, restrictionist, anti-globalist. Farage calls on them to be happy warriors, but they're pessimists. Do they want more unreconstructed libertarianism? I doubt it. They are not like Farage. Thatcher's children. They are his children. They like Farage's positions on British identity and borders, but not markets. They hoot their affection at Farage, not for what he says about free trade, but for the way he says it. Politics is often vibes. Farage gave them 2016, and that year was their political awakening. They should follow him into the deepest ditch if that was what he asked of them. His insurgent energy is undiminished, his pugnacity undiluted, his rhetoric undaunted in the face of all his enemies. More than any Tory in Parliament, and though they do not agree with everything he says, Farage inspires this generation of conservatives. And that's certainly the case, and that's why his meme game is one of his strongest assets, even if reform, and we've got our gripes with reform's policies around this table, particularly after Richard Tice's deselection of Bowe for stating Reform Party policy. Even if reform are not enough, particularly with net zero migration, Farage went on GB News the other night with Camilla Tominey and said 600,000 people a year. No, we need a net outflow, if anything. Even if they're not enough, on vibes alone, he will galvanise a young reactionary base.
Mm-hmm.
He's very energetic. That's what is really good about him, and that's what people respond to. Because you just look at the debate yesterday; there were just tired very much.
Yeah, well, Farage acts as if he knows he has the mandate of heaven.
Yeah.
If you act as if, it's true, if you act as if you have an inevitable victory inbound, like Trump did in 2016, we will get tired of winning, then you almost believe your own hype and everyone else will buy into it.
Fake it till you make it.
It's not necessarily fake it, because I think he's actually having fun. And that's actually good to watch. Like, again, Nigel's not perfect, but I've enjoyed watching him for the last couple of days. If I can feel encouraged, and I'm miserable, like, it's something.
I think it's a tentative win for people on our side of politics. I'm still not convinced by Farage. He's going to do a lot more to make me feel like I could at least partially trust him. But it's going in the right direction. And you're right to say that it is creating a momentum within the UK and a movement, you could even say.
Well, the people around Farage who want him involved in a post-election opposition coalition are certainly more on our side of the fence. And so the people that are bringing those forces together, I think, will shape it more in our direction as well. So I don't really have any reservations in saying, like, if you're in Clacton, obviously vote Farage. But if you want to stick it to the One Nation Conservatives, either in your constituency, vote for one of the rare exemptions for 0 seats, which I'll be debating with Dr. Parvini later, or, I hate to say it, and some of my co-hosts will disagree with me here, but if you want to vote Reform to up the vote total, just to stick it to them, it's not a bad idea. Truthfully, now that Farage is at the helm.
Well, it was either vote Reform or spoil my ballot, so it's...
It's true. And you can tell that they're genuinely afraid of this, because Daniel Hannan came out today in Conservative Home, which is the sort of brainchild of what the Conservative Party thinks about itself, and is himself saying, Farage is a peddler of fantasy politics and well adapted to our TikTok age. And it's like, you're bricking it with the fact that you can talk to Zoomers, aren't you? You're terrified at the exact audience that booed you, which are the conference-going Tory base, which are basically your recruiting force to the next cohort of MPs, bloody hate you, but they really like Nigel. And that's good. I like to see them quaking in their boots. So why do they hate these guys? Okay, well, we've now got this piece in Unheard that from the other day, Britain's young right-wing Tories actually want 0 seats. So that's good news. Dr. Parvini's meme has caught on. So they interviewed 2 people in here that are under pseudonyms, Michael and Ben. Michael's a 24-year-old former Conservative Party activist who doesn't plan to vote in the upcoming election. I bet you he votes Nigel now. He told him that Richard Tice's talking points are delivered by a boomer for boomers. It's basically a miniature version of the Tories. All those concerns about digital currencies and woke environmental activists fall flat with us because we're not thinking about Greta Thunberg. We care about housing and jobs and what kind of country we're going to live in 30 years from now. Ben, who's in his mid-20s and works in Westminster, suggested that young right-wing Zoomers look elsewhere for political inspiration. A lot of these people grew up watching Peter Hitchens' videos in the mid-2010s. They've adopted his view that the Tory party must be destroyed. His impulse is manifested in the new rallying cry of 0 seats, the young British right calling for the Conservatives to be wiped off the electoral map.
Have they got
like
his
these
optimism?
What? AAs?
No, I'm talking about Peter Hitchens.
Oh, well,
They're going to go like this. They're going to be looking down their nose at the Conservatives.
Well, I think actually Peter Hitchens coming out and saying vote Conservative because Labour will be worse has actually torched his credibility. So there's currently a leadership vacuum for Gen Z to look to for who they should follow in this election. And I think Nigel's hoovering it up. So he's just offered them an opportunity to accelerate the demise of the Tories. The Tories are actually bricking it behind the scenes. There's now rumours of multiple Reform defections. I know who some of those people are. If they do defect as planned, the Tories are screwed because they're high profile. Like, we will see. We will absolutely see. So why? That's a good thing to sort of round up, right? So here's one testimony from Matt Goodwin's Substack. Matt has a very good Substack. Hopefully we'll chat to him before the election. This is a testimony of one dispossessed Zoomer in Britain, right? I'm just going to scroll down because so it says, I'm writing this at 3 a.m. in the morning and I have less than 4 hours before I need to get up and start my morning routine for work. But once again, the neighbours who live downstairs below my flat have decided to have another all-night party. Unlike me, they don't have to wake up for work because unlike me, they don't have to work. They qualify for social housing. Their rent is subsidised by the large and rising amount of council tax I am forced to pay for each month, on top of the ruinous income taxes, national insurance contributions and student loan repayments. The majority of the tenants in my housing block are unemployed. I see a few of them leaving the house for work in the morning. My interactions with them are limited to hostile glaring mixed in with the occasional attempted mugging. On the rare occasion I have female company, I have to escort my dates to and from the bus stop to stop being sexually harassed. What scraps of my salary the state allows me to keep are eaten up immediately by rent. I pay almost half my income tax, post-income, to live on an ex-council estate in Zone 3 London, with the smell of weed continually hanging in the air. Unless I achieve an income of more than £200,000, it will simply be impossible to secure a mortgage on a house the same size as the one my parents bought in 1989. If I decide to have children, which you should, which you might think ought to be encouraged given the demographic crisis facing Western nations like Britain, I will have to contend with extortionate childcare costs or deprive my household of a second income. The only feasible route out of this incredibly depressing situation is to leave the city I grew up in and commute 2 hours both ways from a town I have no local connection to. So my situation, where I have no friends or any family living nearby. Even with cheaper housing, I will still have to send my kids to local schools where they will be bombarded with relentless propaganda about how to change their gender, acknowledge their whiteness, and apologise to the British Empire. It is certainly true that my previous generations of young people have faced more challenging circumstances. I am not yet being asked to walk across no man's land and into a sea of barbed wire and machine guns. That the Tories' election announcements have their way, they're certainly gearing you up for it. But it is one thing being asked to suffer for a cause like liberty in Europe, or to grimace through destitution because of a seemingly uncontrollable event like the Wall Street crash. It is quite another to be economically enslaved to the point of infertility to sustain a growing population of resentful dependents. The Zoomer has in fact learned to hate.
I couldn't have put it better myself, really. I mean, this captures the mood of what it is to be under 30 in Britain. Well, I imagine it's probably under 35, under 40 even. Lots of people are struggling.
In many countries, many other countries, including now Germany and the US, have had an actual viable right-wing candidate to direct their energy towards. Finally, Britain has one. And so all of that resentment, justified resentment, towards the importing of net dependents who are swallowing up the housing stock, spitting at you and trying to steal your Rolex and ruin your business, yeah, actually that energy's there.
Even growing up in Plymouth, where there weren't really any foreign people, at least not that I knew of, there'd be like one or two perhaps, there was still the resentment towards the people that were gaming the welfare system. It's still there.
Yeah.
So
there was chav culture in the early 2000s, wasn't there? Where it was looked on to say, well, you're a scrounger, get off. And I think that's also admirable as well.
And it isn't just losing a Rolex. It's also very low-income, working-class people who have children who routinely go to school, and they are being bombarded with a message that somehow you need to atone for what you are.
Yes, quite. I was referring mainly to the watch shop incident where the bloke was mobbed by two blokes and took his own life, which is sad. But you're exactly right. It's not even luxury goods they're stealing. They're just bullying you on the grounds of tribal in-group preference because they have a contempt for you for being a white Christian Englishman. Yeah. That's awful. You shouldn't import that. But for some reason, our global managers seem obsessed with doing so. There's one man that's saying we shouldn't. Now, he isn't saying we shouldn't to nearly the degree that's necessary, because we have still a net outflow of British people under his regime. But I think if someone's going to listen to more migration restrictions, it's probably Nigel. So just to wrap up on this in the last little bits, I mean, this is another reason behind the resentment. I mean, this is a great article. I won't read much of it, but Sam Ashworth-Haynes in The Telegraph just going through all the data about a boomerocracy. Essentially that the housing costs in 2022 took up 24% of the income of a typical household renting in Britain. In 1980, a 30-year-old could only expect to spend 10% of their income on housing. So it just shows the kind of scale that we're battling here. I mean, and the demographic realities of the election mean that because the boomers had far less kids because they wanted to be free and go work and engage in sexual liberation and the like, it means that demographic realities is just the Tories have to try and bribe the boomers. And even then it's not working because they're all hemorrhaging over to reform. And so now you've got essentially the end of the Conservatives, which is that the Conservatives have treated the nation state like a gym membership for a very long time. So it's the Uniparty, and I'm quoting Mary here, which comprises every mainstream political representative of the zombie liberal consensus, views the British nation state as effectively obsolete. It's content-free. It has no culture, no people, nothing to offer than a tourist tat, a flaccid trading zone, and some services that might be achieved on a gym membership basis by just showing up. Are we a nation or not? Aren't we a nation? We aren't a nation when there's any question of preferential treatment based on shared history, heritage, culture, or ancestry. We are, though, when it's a question of coughing up to bankroll whichever set of client group subsidies this iteration of the Uniparty would like to prioritise, boomers or migrants. Perhaps you think I'm being cynical, and perhaps I am, but the point is a serious one. Was Sunak's national service proposal a serious policy designed to be implemented rather than simply fulminated over in the press? It would be crippled from the word go by a profound structural problem. That is, you can't de facto abolish the nation state and then demand all the youth do national service. They're not interested in winning the Zoomers back. That will be the demise of the Conservatives. They've ultimately alienated them through mass immigration. They've impoverished them through the pandemic and locked them up and prevented them having relationships and friendships. They have alienated them from their culture through mass migration. And then they spit in their eye when they say, oh, can we please have some housing? No. So this is why when the One Nation Tories turn around and say this, oh, if you notice any of these problems, you're just stoking culture wars. They're not resonating. But Farage, he goes on TikTok, and a clip of him joking about melons is seen by 1.6 million users and liked by nearly 200,000. Even Tom Harwood, even Albie from GB News, soft Tory wet party member Albie, is saying he's probably going to vote for Farage. Something is really happening here, and it's a joy to see.
Hopefully it all works out. And if you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go on down to lotuseaters.com, where you can find Connor's series and the famed interview with Liz Truss. If you want to see what the mainstream media has been talking about in our interview, make sure to check it out. And if you want to see what other work we're doing, you can also go to our Twitter account, where we share links to everything else. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.